Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here. When I was a small boy, I liked and loved Bugs Bunny cartoons, and he always wanted to be in Palm Springs, right? So finally, I'm here, and he was right. It's a great place. As mentioned, I'm a political scientist and historian born in Prague, the Czech Republic. You know that the Czech Republic was established in the year 1993 as a result of the separation of Czechoslovakia, although some American journalists still haven't noticed this fact and used to call my country Czechoslovakia. That's still, better. Sometimes they even call it Chechnya, which is a bit different country in a different part of the world. My main area of research is the Cold War migration from communist Czechoslovakia, above all to the United States, but I also did a lot of research about the Czechs in Canada, about the Czechs in Australia, New Zealand, and other places. I'm not sure how you define the terms in English, but the term emigration in Czech language generally means the voluntary departure from homeland for economic reasons, while exile is the departure for political, religious, moral, ideological, and other non-economic reasons. Of course, in reality, it is often very difficult to separate these two categories. And for example, the modern history of my nation dealt with the migration fairly often. Many Czechs left beginning in the late 19th century to find better living conditions in Western Europe or in America. At the outbreak of World War I in June 1914, there were almost 350,000 Czechs living in America. The political emigration or an exile resistance to a repressive regime played a significant role during both world wars, then after the communist takeover in February 1948, and later after the Soviet occupation of Czechoslovakia in August 1968. Let me begin with a very brief historical overview so that you have a better idea about Czechoslovakia. The Czechoslovak Republic, or as we call it, the First Republic, was created on October 28, 1918, at the very end of World War I, when the Austrian-Hungarian Empire collapsed and was replaced by a number of independent successor states. The Czechoslovak Republic was actually born on American soil in Pittsburgh. In 1918, the Czech and Slovak political emigres under the leadership of Professor Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk, we can see him on the picture, who later became the first president, and under the strong influence of Americans of Czech and Slovak descent, signed the famous Pittsburgh Agreement, one of the kind of founding documents of the Republic. The Czechoslovak Republic in the interwar period developed along the lines of, I would say, Western capitalist model based on the institution of private property of land and capital, free private enterprise, the operation of an unrestricted market mechanism, the principle of international division of labor, and moderate social reform. And the political system was based on a model of representative, multi-party parliamentary democracy and was strongly influenced by the French, English, and American political systems, of course. The second stage of Czechoslovak economic and political development took place between the years 1938 and 1945. After the Munich Agreement, signed on September 30th, 1948, Nazi Germany occupied the border territories, the border regions with the majority of German-speaking population, and Slovakia declared itself autonomous part of the so-called Second Republic. It lasted for only 5 months because on March the 15th, 1939, Nazi Germany or the German army occupied the Czech lands, transferring them into the so-called protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. And Slovakia became kind of independent puppet state of the Nazi Germany. The highly industrialized economy of the Czech lands was absorbed into the German war machine and remained an integral part of it until the end of World War II. With the exception of the region called Subcarpathian Ruthenia, which became part of Soviet Union in late 1944, the Czechoslovak Republic was re-established at the end of World War II. And between the liberation of the country in May 1945 and the communist takeover in February 1948, the Czechoslovak economy developed into a system which differed radically from the liberal capitalism of 1920s and 1930s. First of all, more than 3.5 million Germans were expelled from Czechoslovakia with the consent of the Allies and were robbed of their possessions. The key industries such as banks, insurance companies, mines, heavy industry were nationalized. A three-phase land reform de facto destroyed private property, and this post-war period was also typified by the rising power of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia and its orientation towards the Soviet Union. We can ask, what were the key elements of the communist success and the defeat of the Democrats? The case of Czechoslovakia shows clearly that the active interest and impressive display of Soviet power, in contrast to the hesitant policy of Western powers, not only formed the background, but was the chief base of communist success in Czechoslovakia, but also in other Eastern European countries. Until the coup d'etat in Czechoslovakia, there was a tendency to ascribe a communist success in Eastern European countries to a lack of democratic traditions, to social backwardness. Also, the presence of Soviet troops at the time of the communist takeovers was said to explain the passivity of the Democrats in these countries. But the Czech coup of February 48 seemed to be of a different variety. As I mentioned, Czechoslovakia was widely known for its democratic traditions and the minimum of social friction. Its highly developed industry was nationalized, as I mentioned. Land reform was introduced, and the communists won the fairly democratic election in May 1946. And all this happened without any revolution. And there were no Soviet troops on Czechoslovak territory when the communists took the power. So what was the reason of the failure of democracy in Czechoslovakia and establishment of the red totalitarian regime, which lasted for more than 4 decades, as in the neighboring countries? First of all, the communists came much better prepared from Moscow, where they spent the war years. They learned how to penetrate all important sectors, how to occupy the crucial positions in regional and local governmental bodies, how to work with propaganda, how to convince the people with their unlimited promises to vote for them. And after they won the election in May 46, they gained control over the most important ministries or departments: the Department of Defense, Interior, Information and Agriculture in the coalition government, and were preparing themselves step by step for the inevitable conflict with their coalition partners, meaning the non-communist parties and pro-Western politicians. While the communists were receiving direct support and instructions on how to proceed from Moscow, from Stalin, the Democrats felt kind of internationally isolated. Both France and Great Britain had to deal with the political crisis at home and the loss of their global colonial empires, and had only very limited interest in Central Europe, which fell, in addition, into the Soviet sphere of influence, as agreed at the Yalta Conference between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin in February 45. The United States was a strong and reliable ally, of course, but it was too far away. And despite some moral support from the US Embassy in Prague, the Czechoslovak Democrats simply didn't have a strong protector from abroad. Some of them believed that Czechoslovakia would, thanks to its strategic position right in the heart of Europe, play the role of the bridge between the West and the East, the mediator and the meeting point where imminent conflicts could be solved. But these naive expectations of Czechoslovak Democrats that their country could be another Switzerland, independent, neutral with its own foreign policy, were quickly dispersed. And the communists, under the leader Klement Gottwald, we can see him on a poster together with Stalin, who became a prime minister, planned to seize absolute power and were just waiting for the right moment to do so. It happened to be the governmental crisis, which developed in late February 48. 12 non-communist ministers, members of the government, from 3 parties resigned in protest against the activities of the communist-controlled security police. In normal circumstances, the president would have accepted the resignations and held new elections. However, the communists feared defeat, so they used threats to prevent elections, as did the Soviet Union through a diplomat sent to Prague, who threatened a Soviet invasion if Moscow's orders were not followed. So the communist-controlled labor unions marched their supporters out onto the streets of Prague and other major cities. Communists also arranged a general strike. They took control in outlying areas and eliminated basically any resistance of the democratic elements in the society. And then it was over. Democracy had been defeated. The president decided not to risk a Soviet invasion or a civil war and surrendered. And the Czechoslovak experiment, democratic experiment in the Soviet bloc was over. And 41 years of oppression began. Joseph Stalin directed the Czechoslovak communists to carry out purges, and the nation held the largest show trials in Eastern Europe. Over a 6-year period between 1949, 1954, 55, the victims of these trials included military leaders, Catholics, Jews, democratic politicians, those with wartime connections with the West, like the ones who used to fight for Royal Air Force, our pilots that were all imprisoned, as well as high-ranking communists. And almost 180 people were executed as the result of these trials. Farmers, especially the wealthy ones, referred to as kulaks, became enemies of the new regime. And during the years of, we call it Stalinization, meaning the early 1950s, almost all farms were nationalized in what was called the collectivization process. No one could own more than 120 acres of land. And while the lives of richer peasants were destroyed, poorer peasants were actually excited at the beginning by the new system. But the communists started to blackmail them, to blackmail the farmers, and threaten them with imprisonment if they did not join the newly established cooperatives. The communists also took over church property. They closed down more than 200 monasteries in the country and were persecuting the clergy. The communist ideology permeated the politically based education system. Students had to study subjects such as Marxism-Leninism. Applicants were accepted into the universities and high schools only if they had working class backgrounds, if they supported the communist regime and had participated in communist youth organizations. And we can easily continue. The fact is that the long era of communism in Czechoslovakia had a devastating effects on the nation's soul and character, which is visible even today, 30 years or 32 years, 33 years after the fall of the Iron Curtain. And another important topic related to this communist takeover is the exile. Because from the moment of the governmental crisis and the following coup, I would say, floodgates of communist oppression opened. And the first politicians, journalists, academics, high government and military officials criticizing the methods of the Reds did not hesitate and rather left Czechoslovakia before they could be imprisoned. In the search for accurate data on this, we call it post-February exile, we encounter widely varying statistics. The researchers are still unable to agree on the magnitude of individual waves of migration between 1948 and 1989. Some authors work with a very rough and I would say overestimated number of 500,000 of Czechs and Slovaks who left the country. I would say that 250, maybe 300,000 is a more realistic figure. The official estimate of the Czechoslovak state security at the end of 1948 states about 8,600 refugees or people who illegally left the country. And for the period between 1948 and 1953, so the first 5 years of the communist regime, state security lists a total number of 43,000 people who left the country. But in reality, we are probably talking about 50, maybe 60,000. The most frequently used path to free world led across the sorry, I need to use the pointer. Oh, it doesn't work. Anyway, it went through the southwestern part of Bohemia, the so-called Šumava Mountains, across the border to Bavaria, which was the American occupation zone of Germany. Until 1951-52, there was no barbed wire, so it was, complicated, dangerous, but not completely impossible to go through Germany. Czechoslovak border to Germany. Bit later, when the border became very heavily guarded, there were many new ways how to go through. And actually, we have similar air museum in Prague, and there are many interesting models, like the very primitive homemade tanks or aircrafts or balloons or even submarines. People simply used these things to go through to Germany. For the people in Moravia, which is the eastern part of the Republic, and Slovakia, it was probably better to get to Vienna, which was divided into 4 occupation sectors, like Berlin. But the thing is that between the Czechoslovak border and Vienna was about 50, maybe 60 miles of Soviet zone. So it happened very often that the refugees were kept by Soviet patrols and were sent back to Czechoslovak territory. The first steps in the free world brought these people into the so-called displaced person camps, mostly in Western occupation zones of Germany or in Austria. These facilities were under the administration of the International Refugee Organization, the IRO, one of the United Nations agencies based in Switzerland. And between 1947 and 1952, the whole refugee agenda in Europe was under the control of the IRO. In July 1948, the Czechs and Slovaks also received the status of political refugees with the same legal protection and benefits as other prior residents of the camps. I'm talking about the Baltic people, about the Hungarians, about the Ukrainians, about the Poles, about the Romanians. It is half forgotten fact that at the end of World War II, almost 20 million people were out of their home countries. These included former forced laborers returning from Germany, expelled German minorities from Eastern Europe and Balkan countries, and above all, people escaping from communist regimes or refusing repatriation back behind the Iron Curtain. Therefore, the International Refugee Organization and number of humanitarian organizations and refugee funds faced an enormous task to accommodate these people, to feed them, to supply with medicine and clothes and other things. The displaced person camps were meant to host only one nationality. There were separate Latvian camps, Polish camps, or Ukrainian camps, but in most cases, several nationalities were living together. And the Czechs and the Slovaks ended up in various locations. As you can see, the accommodation for refugees met only very, very basic requirements. We are talking about wooden shacks, former prisoner of war camps, military barracks, schools, factories, or even more primitive housing such as tents or even train cars. The newly arrived refugees were carefully interviewed and were given some degree of protection or were declared ineligible for protection by the IRO. If there was any suspicion that they were communist spies, infiltrators, or if they had some bad past, bad history, if they were considered Nazi collaborators, for example. The atmosphere in these camps in late 1940s was also extremely tense because there was a widespread belief that the Cold War would quickly change into an armed conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. But time passed, people remained long weeks, months, or even years behind the walls and fences of the DP camps. They were sending visa applications, were waiting for work permits and transport elsewhere. And it was really hopeless for them. And we also need to understand that Western Europe still lay in ruins and the economy was painfully slow in recovering from the war. There was a high unemployment rate. French politics, for example, was confused by permanent political crisis. The same with Great Britain, Netherlands, Belgium, and suddenly these same countries were to be hit by a massive influx of immigrants from somewhere from the east. Logically, they were not prepared for that, and the population did not hide their fears. So refugees rather looked beyond the boundaries of Europe. The dream destination number one was the United States of America, of course, but American immigrant quotas were very strict. So more and more people were going to Latin America, to Australia, New Zealand, Canada. These countries were, looking for fresh blood and experts in a wide range of disciplines. So the medical doctors, engineers, craftsmen, workers in factories and timber plants, they were all cordially invited to Canada, for example. Probably the most open and most welcoming policy showed Australia in late 1940s. You know how huge this country is, how huge this continent is, and it had only 7 million people back in 1940s. So there was a kind of logic and smart decision and idea of Australian government to increase the number of population up to 20 million within 2 decades, within less than 1 generation, and educated, skilled, white refugees from Europe were a clear choice. So between 1945 and 1950, more than 200,000 people from Europe, from the DP camps, were accepted to Australia, including some 10,000 of Czechs and Slovaks. So the Australian government paid the boat ticket, courses of English, accommodation for a few weeks for the start. On the other hand, you had to prepare yourself for 6 weeks on board a ship, sailing across all the oceans to the other side of the world, and then you had to sign a 2-year assignment. You basically had to accept any job you were offered by the Australian government. So it happened pretty often that engineers or doctors had to start as workers or cleaners, and after they fulfilled this 2-year working commitment, they were allowed to move to larger cities and to start or to continue with their original profession. I would say that if I go back, the life in the DP camps deserves much further research. I actually published a book about it in Czech 2 years ago, because I would liken it to a unique microcosm, where you could have found black market, prostitution, violent and boozy clashes, as well as churches, chapels, libraries, schools, kindergartens, scout troops. The people simply trying to live like back home, and they were, waiting for the future. They were also publishing magazines, newspapers. Even the first seeds of political activity was born there, because the party units of the political parties that were disbanded or simply morphed into harmless satellites of communist parties back behind the Iron Curtain tried to kind of reestablish themselves in exile and try to rebuild their broken structures. So it is a great topic, and always when I give a talk for university students, I try to convince them to work on this topic as well, because there are plenty of material, unique material. I had a chance to consult the collections of the United Nations or the International Refugee Organization in New York and Geneva, and there are hundreds and even thousands of boxes full of unique material. While I was doing my research on the Czechoslovak exile and its developments and the Czechoslovak refugees, I began to think in a broader way about Cold War emigres from all the countries behind the Iron Curtain, from Central and Eastern Europe. And I began to question how the Czechoslovak experience was unique and specific in comparison to the Polish, Hungarian, Bulgarian, or Baltic emigres. Political emigration has played a prominent role in the modern history of all the countries in this region, as well as the, I would say, Eastern European ethnic presence in the United States. Between 1880s and World War I, the Central, Southern, and Eastern Europe accounted for about 75% of total American immigration. Later, the number of incomers from these countries decreased a bit due to immigration quotas and other restrictions, but still, in 1930, we are talking about 2 million of Polish immigrants who lived in America, Slovaks, 300,000 Hungarians, 200,000 immigrants from Yugoslavia, and we can easily continue. And after the Yalta conference in 1945, a large number of political emigres arrived. These people had already experienced communist rule and were, convinced that the Yalta agreements were not conducive to an independent and democratic existence for the Eastern European countries. And they decided to remain in the West, did not, return to their homelands after the liberation in 1944-45, and simply watched the irreversible Sovietization from afar. As you know, the communists, backed by Moscow, took power in Albania, Romania, and Bulgaria in 1944-45. Hungary and Poland followed soon after, and Czechoslovakia fell as the, I would say, very last limited pluralist democracy in February 48. And former democratic politicians, diplomats, high government and military officials, as well as journalists and academics, did not hesitate for long to leave and to start another struggle for freedom and democracy in exile. For example, for the Czech exile leaders, it was their third exile in past 30 years. When the Czech lands were still part of Austrian-Hungarian Empire, many of the political leaders left for Western Europe and then for America to fight against the Habsburgs. Then they returned home. They had their democratic republic for 20 years. Then they had to leave again in 1939, and they were fighting against the Nazis for 6 years. Then they came back home for another 3 years, and 1948, and the communist takeover forced them to leave again for the third time in past 3 years. So some of the stories were very tragic. At first, they settled in Munich, Paris, or London, but soon after the, I would say, headquarters of exile activities moved overseas to New York or Washington, D.C. Let's wait a bit. In the United States, in December 1947, the newly formed National Security Council warned that the Soviet Union was conducting an intensive propaganda campaign directed primarily against the United States, employing coordinated psychological, political, and economic measures to undermine non-communist elements in Europe and elsewhere. And the only response available to weaken and to roll back this communist influence was to initiate a psychological offensive in return. The director of the policy planning staff at the State Department, George Force Cannon, was later known as one of the architects of the Cold War, presented the document called The Inauguration of Organized Political Warfare at the National Security Council meeting on May the 4th, 1948, in the presence of President Harry S. Truman. Actually, last week I was doing my research at Truman Library in Independence, Missouri, and I had a chance to consult the papers and minutes from the National Security Council meetings in 1948 and 1949. So it was very interesting. And Cannon highlighted the importance of providing assistance for all types of liberation committees, underground activities behind the Iron Curtain, and the support of all anti-communist elements in threatened countries of the free world and of Europe. We can say that the battle was already lost in Central and Eastern Europe, but we need to remember that there was still the civil war in Greece between the communists and the monarchists. Communist parties were very strong and influential in France and Italy. So, there were still many battlegrounds in Europe. And Cannon also recommended to establish a public organization to sponsor selected political exile organizations to pursue their anti-Soviet and anti-communist activities, to support, popular resistance directly within communist-led nations, and to prepare liberation movements for the eventuality of an armed conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. Cannon talked about many types of covert activities behind the Iron Curtain, about information campaigns, propaganda campaigns, and launching of a new information channels, and also uniting of political exiles through a common organizational platform. And all these were the beginnings of the organization called the National Committee for Free Europe, which was established in May 1949. The founders of this organization were not initially certain about or of its purpose and functions. They knew the National Committee for Free Europe would not provide humanitarian aid to refugees or help with applications for US visas for those still interned in the DP camps. Instead, it would focus on a chosen group of democratic political leaders who had successfully made it to the United States to find appropriate employment and make use of abilities during their stay in America. The committee's articles of association were signed in New York City on May 17, 1949, and at its first press conference, this 4-point program was introduced. And through the founding of the National Committee for Free Europe, the political, organizational, and operational groundwork for all forms of anti-Soviet and anti-communist propaganda was in place. The financial aid for the activities of the National Committee was assured. The donations officially came from private donors and large corporations such as Chevrolet, Ford Motor Company, General Electric, Chase National Bank, but above all was the behind-the-scenes support from the Department of State and the CIA. It became known after 3 decades that this whole project was financed and directed by the CIA. And it is obvious that very lot of money went to exile organizations to finance their activities. The budget started with $1 million in 1949, and in 1954 it was already 8 million or so. So in subsequent years, many common projects unifying the exiles came to life under the supervision of the National Committee for Free Europe. For example, there was this information campaign called Crusade for Freedom, warning the American public about the communist threat. There was the Europe College providing university education to talented students among the emigres. They had a nice campus in the Château Pourtalais, not far from Strasbourg in France. There was also the publication of a monthly periodical, or a monthly journal called News from Behind the Iron Curtain. And of course, the broadcasting of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, which started in May 1951. And all of this was devised and funded by the National Committee for Free Europe, and in all of these, the leaders of exiled communities participated as editors, analysts, lecturers. These coordination efforts also resulted in the organization called the Assembly of Captive European Nations, which officially saw the light of day on September 20th, 1954 in New York City. As a non-incorporated, non-profit company, the Assembly was intended to act as a shadow counterbalance to the United Nations, and was meant to coordinate the management of anti-communist campaigns, to publicize the news from behind the Iron Curtain, and to generate international support for the liberation of Soviet-ruled parts of Europe. The structure of the Assembly generally followed the structure of the United Nations. It consisted of a General Assembly, General Committee, and several working committees. The sessions were held once a year, usually in September, and these functioned as the sanctioning assemblies, which various resolutions were announced, and the members of the General Committee were elected. And also lectures and situational reports on developments in individual countries of Eastern Europe were presented, and voting on resolutions and protests took place at these sessions as well. They took place in New York City to coincide with the United Nations General Assembly sessions, and were frequently also coordinated with public demonstrations to raise their profile and increase the volume of the message. Between 1956 and 1963, the Assembly rented a 2-story building owned by the Carnegie Endowment on First Avenue in Manhattan, directly opposite the United Nations headquarters. So the UN delegates from communist countries simply could not avoid the unpleasant view of posters and billboards hanging just across the street that alerted passers-by to the ongoing Red Terror and Soviet imperialism from 1996 after the Hungarian Revolution. The democratic politicians had made the United States the focus of their liberation efforts. The organizations I mentioned did not aspire to determine the future political and economic structure for their countries, but aimed to bring about a situation wherein the people would be able to decide without any foreign interference the form of government they wanted to live under. Naturally, there are different views and disagreements about what would constitute an effective liberation. The conservative and extremist part of the exile community claimed that only a complete eradication of communism would assure it. The majority, however, said that many of the economic and social changes introduced under the communists would have to stay because they had become a part of each nation's life. But they demanded free elections, of course. And some emigre politicians even began to argue that liberation might come from a gradual democratization of hopes for the liberation, even with the risk of an armed conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, ran highest probably during 1952 presidential election and the campaign between Dwight Eisenhower and Adlai Stevenson, when there was much talk about liberation. The votes of American Czechs, Poles, Hungarians, and the others sent the Republican candidate, Dwight Eisenhower, to the White House because they expected that he would take a tough stance against the Soviets, because he was a general, he had experience from Europe, he saw what was happening in May 1945 in Czechoslovakia and other countries. And after the death of Joseph Stalin in March 1953, it seemed that opportunities for change in particular countries of the Soviet bloc would open up. The first attempts were seen in Czechoslovakia and in the German Democratic Republic, where in June 1953 there were serious social protests which involved about 400,000 people in over 250 locations across the country, including East Berlin, but they were pacified very quickly as a result of a Soviet military intervention. So that was kind of a first serious blow to the hopes and naive expectations of the emigres. The other one was the Geneva Summit of July 1955, where the representatives of the United States, United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union met for the first time in a decade following the end of World War II. Before the summit, the Western leaders were swamped with telegrams and resolutions from various exile organizations demanding that the problem of liberation should be put on the agenda. Although even Eisenhower seemed to be open to the suggestion, the issue of liberation was not raised in Geneva, and moreover, the summit was followed by a period of disappointments. The communist Albania, Hungary, Bulgaria were admitted to the United Nations, and the failure of the West to intervene effectively in the Polish and Hungarian uprisings in 1956 raised the question whether there was room for political exiles and their activities in the world where two conflicting systems tolerated one another. If we talk about Czechoslovakia, another tragedy appeared in 1968. As you know, on August 21st, 5 armies of Warsaw Pact, led by the Soviets, occupied Czechoslovakia to crack down on reformist trends of the leadership in Prague. What happened exactly? In early 1968, conservative leader and the president, Antonín Novotný, was ousted as the head of the Communist Party and was replaced by Alexander Dubček. He was a young Slovak communist. And the new government of Dubček ended censorship in early 1968, and the acquisition of this freedom resulted in a public expression of broad-based support for reforms and a public sphere in which government and party policies could be debated openly. In April 1968, the Czechoslovak government issued a formal plan for further reforms, although it tried to liberalize within the existing framework of the Marxist-Leninist state and did not propose any revolutionary overhaul of the political and economic systems. This whole process was called the Prague Spring. Soviet leaders were concerned over these recent developments in Czechoslovakia, of course, recalling the 1956 uprising in Hungary. Kremlin worried that if Czechoslovakia carried reforms too far, other satellite states in Eastern Europe might follow, leading to a widespread rebellion against Moscow's leadership. And after much debate, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union leadership, led by Leonid Brezhnev, decided to intervene to establish a more conservative and pro-Soviet government in Prague. Here is a funny poster, asking what are they doing? They are looking for counter-revolution. That reminds me, some of the current events in Ukraine, because the Russian leadership claimed that they came to Ukraine to liberalize the country from the Nazis and to prevent a Nazi revolution. So I guess that the narrative is the same for the past 60 years. So the Soviets claimed to come to Czechoslovakia to liberate the country from counter-revolution. When the occupation forces invaded, they swiftly took control of Prague and other major cities and communication and transportation links. Given the escalating US involvement in the conflict in Vietnam, as well as past US pronouncements on non-intervention in the Eastern Bloc, the Soviets guessed correctly that the United States would condemn the invasion, but refrain from intervening. Although the Soviet crackdown on Czechoslovakia was swift and successful, small-scale resistance continued throughout early 1969, while the Soviets struggled to install a stable government. Finally, in April 1969, the Soviets forced Dubček and the rest of the reformist wing of the Communist Party from power in favor of more conservative administrators. And in the years that followed, the new leadership re-established government censorship and controls preventing freedom of movement. And the invasion of 1968 also caused another massive wave of migration. But this time it was different. The Western European governments benevolently extended tourist visas to Czechoslovak citizens abroad and positively processed applications for political asylum. Because this time the Czechs and the Slovaks were considered victims of a Soviet aggression, the Soviet invasion. Even some of the European countries that wanted to stay completely untouched by the influx of refugees in late 1940s, like Switzerland or Sweden, this time in 1968 they were very open and accepted thousands of Czechoslovak refugees. So in general, the level of sympathy of the free world could not be compared to the period after February 1948, when people often fled to save their lives without any property, and after overcoming the Iron Curtain, months of uncertainty and hardship awaited them in the refugee camps. After the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Czechoslovak borders remained open for quite some time, and those who owned a passport had a chance to slip out for a few months. The state security data in the years 1968-1969 alone reported 70,000 people who left the country. And for the entire period between 1968 and the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989, we are talking about 130,000 people who left the country. And the motivation to leave was obvious. It was the fear of the consequences of the occupation, political oppression, and of course the desire for a better living. Because 2/3 of the emigres were of a working age, mostly between 20 and 30 years, and 40% of them represented workers' professions. So they settled in Western European countries. They were also attracted by Australia, Canada, South Africa, which showed the most friendly and open welcoming policy and processed the immigration visas within a few weeks or even within a few days, compared to one long waiting period to America or 5 months to Canada. But in the meantime, the emigres had to wait in the refugee camps again. The largest one was Traiskirchen near Vienna in Austria. So as a conclusion, we can say that both emigre generations, the one after 1948 and the one after 1968, had to go through a complicated bureaucratic process before they were accepted by Western countries and could have resettled and started new life. But as educated, hardworking, and adaptable people, they successfully integrated at the end. As you know, the Cold War and the communist supremacy over Eastern Europe lasted for more than 4 decades. And the majority of, we can call them the fighters for freedom and democracy, did not live to see the fall of the Iron Curtain in November 1989. Therefore, we historians need to catalog their efforts and make sure that their work will not be forgotten. So thank you very much for your attention, and now I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.